Let's look at some classification of groups: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. First of all, what are these kind of groups? So we'll look at carbons first. Okay, and so we have this compound. Focus on the carbon. Here is a carbon that is attached to just one carbon, and therefore this carbon is considered to be a primary carbon. This carbon is connected to two carbons, and therefore it is known as a secondary carbon. In this structure, we have one carbon over here that is connected to one carbon, therefore it's a primary carbon. This carbon here, the second one, is connected to two carbons, so this becomes a secondary carbon. This carbon is connected to 1, 2, 3 carbons, and therefore this is a tertiary carbon. The first one here, again outside, is a primary carbon. The terminal carbons are usually going to be primary carbons. Let's classify all the carbons in this compound. Here you have primary carbon. The primaries are easier because they're all going to be the terminal ones hanging outside. So here are your primary carbons, all of these. This carbon in the middle is a quaternary carbon because it's connected to 4 carbons, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so this one is a quaternary carbon. This one here, the one that's labeled number 4, is a secondary carbon, and then this over here would be a tertiary carbon because it's connected to 1, 2, 3 carbons. Okay, 1, 2, and then 3 carbons. So in this compound, there are all sorts of different carbons. Now let's look at other groups that are connected. So for example, let's look at hydrogens that can be primary, secondary, or tertiary. So let's draw this structure again. And here we have 3 hydrogens. Because these 3 hydrogens are connected to a carbon that is primary, all of these become primary hydrogens. Quaternary carbon does not have any hydrogens there, so there are no hydrogens here, so therefore we don't have to worry about this. Again, there is a CH3 here, so all primary carbons, okay, they will have primary hydrogens. Here we had a secondary carbon, and so we had 2 hydrogens here, so these are secondary hydrogens. Here on this carbon there is only 1 hydrogen, and this would be tertiary because this carbon is a tertiary carbon. These hydrogens here would be primary, these are primary, and then these are primary. That's how you classify hydrogens. So for example, if you look at a structure like this, where you have a CH2, 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 another one, and another one. Here, since each carbon is connected to 2 carbons, all hydrogens here are secondary. Okay, so that's how you classify the hydrogens. Now let's look at some other groups. Say a halide. It's exactly the same thing. So for example, let's look at this compound. This carbon here is a primary carbon because it's connected to 1 carbon over here, and so therefore this chlorine is a primary chlorine. This chlorine here is connected to a carbon that is connected to 1, 2, and 3 carbons, so this chlorine is a tertiary chlorine. This chlorine here, the one that I'm going to circle, this one is connected to 1, 2 carbons, so therefore this is a secondary. So this carbon is connected to 2. Essentially, if a halide is connected to a secondary carbon, it is a secondary halide. Okay, so primary carbon gives primary halide, primary hydrogen, secondary carbon gives secondary halide or secondary hydrogen. Tertiary carbon gives tertiary halide and tertiary hydrogen. Okay, and the same thing goes for any other group. All right. So now let's look at alcohols. It's the same thing with alcohols. This one, secondary alcohol, because you have this carbon, the alcohol group that is connected to one carbon is connected to 1 and 2 carbons, so this is a secondary alcohol. This alcohol would be considered a tertiary because this is connected to 1, 2, 3 carbons. Okay, that's what this carbon is connected to, so this is a tertiary alcohol. If I were to put an OH over here, this would be classified as primary alcohol. Again, it's the same thing, okay, as with the halides. Amines are slightly different. Amines are all based on ammonia, okay, and so you remove one hydrogen and add an alkyl group. So for example, CH3, NH2, if you have two CH3s, then you only have one hydrogen. If you have three CH3s, then you have no hydrogen whatsoever. So when you have only one alkyl group, this is considered to be a primary amine. If you have two alkyl groups, then it is considered to be secondary. And if you have three alkyl groups, it is tertiary. Tertiary amines have no hydrogens, okay, at all. You can have amines in cyclic compounds also. So for example, if we take something like this, in this case, the nitrogen is connected to 2 carbons, so therefore this is a secondary amine. If I were to take this, here the nitrogen is connected to 1, 2, 3 carbons, so this is a tertiary amine. So this is how you would classify different kinds of carbons, hydrogens, halides, alcohols, and amines.